I'm Abdul Saad, clinical psychologist at Vital Mind Psychology here in Sydney, Australia. Recording this video a little bit late. I think I recorded the first installment for this new series 2 weeks ago. We have been under lockdown here in Sydney. All is well. The biggest issue that I've had to deal with personally is not being able to get a haircut or a beard trim. So compared to other parts of the world who've been dealing with this crisis, we're doing quite well here. Thank God. So spiritual dimensions of narcissism, psychic emptiness and rage. Because narcissism robs one of its center, it inevitably produces a vacuum, a void, or an empty shell, which must be filled with something to avoid the incredible psychic pain which is experienced as psychic emptiness, an experience that's common in individuals who suffer from borderline personality disorder. Now, I'm going to start by commenting on the personality disorder dimension to give us some critical context, and then I'll branch it out to everyday life. So one key difference between borderline PD and narcissistic PD is that in narcissism, we see more sophisticated strategies to mask this psychic emptiness, the deep void inside. In borderline PD, in many ways, what we're seeing is a more honest and accurate picture of what happens to us when we become fragmented and when we lose our center. The narcissist too is fragmented and has no real center. She or he simply has more sophisticated ways of keeping at bay this deep psychic emptiness. And chief amongst these strategies is the grandiose self, which anesthetizes or numbs them from their emptiness. So the more grandiose and inflated one becomes, the more emptiness they are dealing with inside. And this emptiness, however, is only exemplified in its more extreme forms in a condition like borderline PD, because the psyche has become so fragmented, it is no longer coherent, it doesn't have an integrated, unified center that connects all parts of the psyche together. In the narcissist, we see a pseudo-center, the grandiose self, but this self is hollow. It looks good, but there is not much going on underneath. So if we look at the borderline personality is searching for the divine, the archetypal king or queen who will rescue and heal them. And they are constantly disappointed by people who let them down in this regard. They go around making people kings and queens only to dethrone them because they keep getting disappointed. No one can feel the deep psychic pain, emptiness, and lovelessness they feel. The narcissist, in contrast, believes he or she is the king or queen, arrogating to themselves a position they are neither entitled to, nor do they possess the qualities and power to manifest. This can go some way in explaining the pathological attraction we see between individuals with borderline personality traits, or the full-blown disorder, and those with narcissistic traits, or the full-blown disorder. So again, like in borderline personality, narcissism too has this destructive, fragmenting influence on the psyche. But the difference with narcissism is there is a lot more ego strength than what we see typically in the borderline personality, which fragments a lot more easily under duress. Narcissism has an inflating effect on the self. It puffs one up. It fills one up. Hence why pride is a deadly sin in the three great monotheisms. For pride leaves no room for humility, leaves no room for God. The proud knows it all, cannot be corrected, and can certainly never admit to being wrong. So what is beneath the pathological narcissist, the narcissistic personality disorder, the malignant narcissist, the tyrant, is a borderline personality structure, which is why we see narcissists fragment into clinical levels of paranoia, emptiness, rage, and sadism when the inflated, grandiose self is toppled. Now, when you're hearing this, I want you to think about big-ticket narcissists in history, tyrants, your pharaohs, your Hitlers, your Stalins, your Pol Pots, not someone who necessarily hurt you in a romantic relationship. Although I'm not saying it's impossible that they could have a pathology at this level, but I really want to ground the discussion initially in big league stuff, big ticket stuff, and not the garden variety stuff we're often calling narcissism. So these clinical levels of paranoia, emptiness, rage, and sadism, when the inflated, grandiose self is toppled, when the inner pharaoh confronts the reality that God, divinity, the absolute consciousness is greater and in control than he or she, and that he or she cannot escape punishment, humiliation, loss, and death. Now, interestingly, a culture in which death is taboo and cannot be discussed is by definition a narcissistic culture, engrossed in its own grandiosity, drunk on its delusion of unlimited progress, power and control over reality and nature. Cultures which have become completely horizontalized ultimately self-destruct, becoming technologically advanced as we have become in modern Western culture, like no other time that has preceded it, but lacking a core, a center, making modern culture extremely toxic to the human spirit, modern popular culture, mainstream culture. So, again, I'm using borderline and narcissistic PD here as extreme reference points to illustrate these concepts. I don't want you to think, oh, those poor or crazy borderlines or those evil, prideful, inflated narcissists. I'm glad I'm not one of them. I want you to now consider how these extreme manifestations can also operate within you and me, albeit in a less extreme way, because we may not be completely personality disordered, but still have some narcissistic elements nonetheless. So bringing this back to you and me, we see this narcissism playing out in our everyday life, and not only at the extremes of severe personality pathology. So reflect on these questions. What angers you? What enrages you? What triggers you? Reflect on that, and perhaps there is an aspect of your own narcissism being triggered. Again, this doesn't mean every time you or I get angry, there is narcissism lurking in the shadows. Anger is not inherently a pathological emotion. It can be an activating force which drives us to overcome obstacles, to fight and resist injustice. The anger I'm addressing here is more of a self-indulgent, incandescent rage, one that knows no limits, consumes the angry person and those to whom the anger is directed. When we get this angry, we better bet we have experienced some form of narcissistic injury. In spiritual psychology, we may call this as the toppling of one of our false gods or idols, our sacred cows, our golden calves. Reflect on this and you'll understand why individuals with MPD are so sensitive to criticism, a reality I see all the time when I watch one of my favorite shows, Kitchen Nightmares, where Gordon Ramsay is an expert at toppling the false idols and gods inhabiting the inner kingdoms of cocky chefs and restaurateurs who are in denial about their failure. Whatever you think about the character of Gordon Ramsay, and no, I don't think he has MPD, the point is a popular culture show is illustrating the very dynamics we are discussing here. In fact, Kitchen Nightmares is a great way of seeing this level of narcissism in action. Those whose narcissism cracks and can access their humility, who become deflated in front of the master, and can then submit to his guidance, have a fighting chance at surviving and making it. They experience an archetypal deflation, get back in touch with reality, and then come back to life. Sometimes the divine needs to hit us with such a sledgehammer for us to wake up. Do we have our spiritual eyes and ears open and a heart that can be accessed? Or do we remain drunk on our own grandiosity, which eventually must be smashed? Often we need to break down before we can break through. And if you read the New Testament Gospels from this perspective, it brings into sharp focus the at times harsh words Christ used in rebuking people. So again, in Kitchen Nightmares, and I'm not holding up Gordon Ramsay as someone possessing a Christ consciousness or some high moral character. He's a blunt instrument, which is sometimes needed. Those chefs and restaurateurs who become stiff-necked, more emboldened in their narcissism, more inflated, and unable to handle the criticism, crash and burn in the fires of their own false gods. False gods who cannot sustain them because they have no real power. They are idols, imitations, counterfeits, and reality will deal with them accordingly by deflating and humiliating them. And this spiritually is ultimately the end of narcissism, and it has historically been the end of every tyrant that has existed in history. They have been humbled and humiliated, if not by anything other than death. And in this we see the central folly of narcissism, and the narcissism operating within you and me, and at a more extreme level in the personality disordered individual. In a narcissism that has completely overtaken our inner kingdom, it is the failure to submit, to be humbled, to realign oneself with reality. The NPD is possessed by a level of archetypal inflation that sometimes can only be deflated by death, the archetypal battle between Pharaoh and Moses. Hence, the central theme of all Orthodox spiritual and religious world traditions, especially the three great monotheisms, which I have studied in more detail compared to the other traditions, is submit or perish. And this is not a submission to a tyrant, because I know the word submission has acquired all manner of negative connotations. Submission here is submission to reality, submission to what is in alignment with the inherent design and decree of divinity, whether you call it nature, Mother Nature, cosmic reality, whatever you call it, it is a level of consciousness and an intelligence which exists independently from you and me. And we get into trouble when we are not in alignment with it. So, like in Kitchen Nightmares, sometimes our narcissism requires a reality check, the type only a Gordon Ramsay can deliver. It seems harsh and unloving, but it can be what is needed to bring us back into alignment. The more shocking and jolting the reality check, the more likely it is we have been ignoring the lighter reality checks we have been receiving. And Gordon, if you're watching, I know you're a fan and you've got a big heart. So what triggers your inner Pharaoh? Again, we're looking at the narcissism on this sliding scale where the manifestations of narcissism, of diabolical evil in the world at that extreme level are also manifesting in you and me, or can manifest in you and me at less extreme levels. It's this spectrum or continuum model. So what triggers your inner Pharaoh? What are you sensitive to? What is your kryptonite? What is it, if criticized, would so trigger you that you too would go into a narcissistic rage, albeit muted or less intense than a full-blown NPD? What makes you aggressive, passive-aggressive, pout, sulk, scorn? What makes you want to cut people down to size, to prove to them that they are fools, prove that you are better, smarter, more moral than they are? All of these can be fruitful indicators to where your own hidden grandiosity is lurking. Who do you hate? Who do you obsess over? Who do you secretly envy? Again, these are questions to invite reflection and not judgment or blame or self-condemnation. So in you and me, the narcissism may be more veiled, or it can manifest intermittently, which means if we are spiritual seekers, we need to be more attuned to how it may manifest. This does not mean becoming morally scrupulous or OCD about our faults, which, funnily enough, can itself become a manifestation of narcissism. I need to be so holy, otherwise God cannot accept me, which arrogates to the self a moral standard that even the divine is beholden to. In other words, I'm so evil, I'm so far gone, I'm so bad, I'm so rotten, that even if God wanted to forgive me, if we can use the language of the great monotheisms, even if God wanted to forgive me, he could not, which is a veiled form of narcissism, spiritual narcissism. So this isn't about becoming self-punishing masochists on the lookout for how we are deviant. It's about becoming self-aware realists who, by confronting our own narcissism, we can live a more authentic life. We're able to extend grace toward others and not be insufferable in our own beliefs about how right we are, how bad others are, or how the world owes us something. It's about becoming more real. It's about keeping it real, in being more in alignment with reality and more integrated and less polarized. We reap the greatest dividend, true freedom. So that's my hope in this series, that it's about helping us see things through this spectrum model rather than through this more compartmentalized dichotomous model where it's either or, black and white, but seeing the shades of gray and seeing narcissism on this spectrum. If you invite this perspective into your life, I believe will reap great dividends for you in your own personal transformation journey. I look forward to seeing you for part 3 of this series, God willing. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. All the very best. Bye-bye.